So there's so much complexity we're going to try to cover today, but so let's just dive into it. Historically, video games, the kind of games I remember watching over my brother's shoulders playing, because I didn't really play, often portrayed female characters in very stereotypical roles.
Yep.
How have these portrayals, or have they, evolved over the years?
Yeah. In some ways, we've seen representations of female characters in games follow a similar trajectory to what we've seen in other media like film and like television, where they slowly and steadily are moving from being sort of passive background characters to active parts of stories, to non-player characters, like just in-game characters that we can interact with, that direct us in the game, and then to characters that we get to play beside or play as, like Princess Peach, for instance, or Zelda, or Tana, of characters that started as kind of background decoration and the sort of goal for male characters in the games that have slowly become characters we can play ourselves.
Right.
We've also seen more recently franchises building out that feature a woman at the center of the story of the game, like Tomb Raider, which was an early and ongoing example of this, and more recently the phenomenal success of Horizon Zero Dawn, which gives us a similar sort of story of, that would be the dog, of a sort of woman at the center of this action-packed world, right? And that's in a way that is sort of mirroring the changes that we've witnessed historically. But that's not the same as saying everything is fantastic, because
No, we'll dive into some of the problems.
Yeah.
But you mentioned Tomb Raider as an early and consistent, where women are not just passive, they're actually the active character that you get to play, and primarily probably men, but men and women can play this character. What other moments do you see, from the gaming sector, from the games, or, either a game in itself or just some kind of moment, like similar to that, where you see there's a more shift towards a nuanced, empowered portrayal of women from these sort of passive, they're just in the game, you don't even interact, to you can interact and then you can actually play. Like, that's a really interesting trajectory. Are there other moments where you think, that was an interesting moment from a developer point of view, or was that even developer driven, or was that consumer driven demanding that?
Yeah, I think a great example that sort of overlaps a bunch of this is, and I'm taking us back to the 90s, so this might be more memorable for some than others, of what was called at the time the girls' games movement in the 1990s.
Oh, okay.
In which we had a bunch of independent studios and game designers and developers, primarily women, say there's this huge untapped market that the big companies are very deliberately overlooking on purpose. And so let's make games aimed specifically at girls and young women. And some of this was, I guess a good word for it is kind of educational, right? The 90s is the time where tech is increasingly part of our classrooms and part of what we have access to at home. And so there's this hope that by getting more girls and young women interested in playing video games, they become more comfortable with technology more broadly, and then better equipped for the world of tomorrow, right?
Interesting. Yeah.
And then at the same time, these studios all wanted to come up with different kinds of games than these sort of action and violence ones that were dominating the market at the time, by offering different sorts of stories and different gameplay experiences. And so most of the studios that were part of this girls games movement have folded since. Some of them have kept going. One of them that I have done a bunch of research and playing myself, Her Interactive, which is the studio behind the Nancy Drew video game. So for everybody
so
that has
fascinating. I
always
didn't know
wanted
that. Yeah.
to be Nancy Drew, there's, about 30 something of them now.
And is that geared
so-
towards like women who would have read Nancy Drew, right? Because Nancy Drew is an old franchise. Like that's not a modern franchise. Of course, those stories get retold and young women rediscover them. So who are they marketing that to? Like, is that for women like you and me who would have read that in kind of real time, or for, you know, my nieces who are learning it and rediscovering it?
Yeah, Her Interactive was really strategic about its early marketing, going for, obviously, when you are trying to bring in younger players, you are advertising in part to them and in part to their parents as the people in control of what gets purchased. And so some of this was sort of a nod to parents who would have been familiar with Nancy Drew from their own childhood. And some of this is just, Nancy Drew is unstoppably popular. Despite being such an old character at this point, she continues to be made and remade, and this kind of action adventure mystery solving girl continues to be just such a powerful figure that she was a great choice for trying to make games that worked a little differently but still offered an exciting experience, but with a young girl at the center of the story, making all of these choices about how to bring the villain to justice, right? And so this movement in the 90s introduced a whole bunch of different play styles into the market that as these companies studied the feedback they were receiving, the information they had about who was buying and playing these, and people just writing them saying, I love this game, thank you so much.
Right.
They learned very quickly that it wasn't just girls and young women playing. It was all sorts of people that were excited to have different kinds of games to play.
That's an
And
interesting
so what
distinction.
was designed, what was designed initially to be, this is what girls like, ended up becoming an initial attempt to broaden the way we define what counts as a game and what counts as a good game by bringing in sort of puzzle style stuff and games oriented around friendships and relationships and fashion. The whole series of Barbie video games from the 90s was very organized around fashion and being Barbie and dressing up and
consumerism, obviously, too.
Yes. Yes.
Good.
Yes.
I love that, you know, we've stepped into the production side, which is so fascinating. And probably thank you for mentioning Her Interactive, because it shows how, like, when women start to design or are part of the design conversations, games maybe that aren't just, obviously this was a very there was a deliberate effort to create games that women and young girls respond to, but I think it also changes the gameplay in spaces where typically it's more male dominated, right? We've talked about in previous conversations women like Roberta Williams and Amy Hennig who've really left a significant mark on the industry. And can you share a bit more? Like, you've talked a little bit, but let's dive into it, because I think it's just so powerful. It's such a powerful example. Like, the gaming industry has shifted so much because women's participation has developed. Like, there's still a lot of inequities. We'll cover that, but it's increased. So, you know, how has the role of women in game development changed since pioneers like Roberta and Amy actually emerged?
Not as much as we would want.
Okay. Yeah.
There's
still work to do.
There is still lots of work to do. It is a wonderful storyline to imagine. We had these trailblazing women and the gates opened up behind them, and nothing has gone quite that way. Data often provided by the industry itself tells us that women still make up a small percentage of game developers. The most recent, the Game Developer Conference, which is a big industry event, they put out every year what they call the State of the Game Industry reports. And the one for 2024 tells us that less than 25% of game developers are women. And if we go back through their previous yearly reports, we notice that number hasn't changed much. It's been sitting right around there for quite some time. So even when some companies are taking very public steps to try to make a difference, it's still a big uphill battle, not just to get women in there, but also to keep them in there. And so we are still stuck in what is a not very inspiring sort of picture of what this is like as a workplace for women.
So, okay, so what you said about 25%, like it's like, okay, so a quarter.
I think the number for 2024 was actually 23%.
23,
but it hovers around there.
That area, okay. Yeah. And I'm sure there's also, if you don't have the stats, it's fine, but I'm sure, it raises questions around even gender equality at more senior level roles, right? Because we know that as this is sort of the glass ceiling effect, where women generally have a harder time breaking into the senior roles, and senior roles is often where those major decisions are being made. We know that pay disparities, obviously at the Pay Equity Office we talk a lot about pay disparities, remain an issue on almost every industry. But I will say some good news for software developers and programmers in Ontario. The gender wage gap for them on average is 7%, whereas the provincial average is 12%. So there's something interesting happening in that space where, and I think, that is something to celebrate. I think we should mention that because that's still a significant pay gap. I'm not downplaying that, but to say there is something happening in that industry.